Okay, welcome back to another VR headset review here. One I think that people are going to be a bit excited for. Today, we're going to be looking at the Crystal Super's Micro-OLED optical engine, which I have on my head right now, and that's why I kind of got this different color visor here. But that's not the endorsement it may sound like if anyone's rushing to buy this already just because I'm using it. I am using it for a very specific reason, so slow down and let's dive right into all these specs since there is a lot to cover here. But before that, some important disclaimers. Standard reviewer stuff. Pimax did send me this for review, but there are no stipulations on what I could or could not say. Secondly, I did already have a first impressions video recently of some prototypes. There are still some notable changes in places, but a few things aren't that different. So if you did already see that or my 50 ppd super review, feel free to skim on the sections like the audio, the comfort, software, and the tracking, because it's all reasonably similar there, and this is a module that's for the shell of the Super here. I'll still be covering those things a bit for people who didn't, but this review is primarily going to be focusing on the module itself with the optics and screens, but a little bit of touching on the software and the like, because there have actually been some notable changes there since I originally reviewed the 50 ppd. Okay, let's jump into some of the notable differences. That's why you're here. Starting with field of view, since I do that every time because it's a big thing for me. Starting with what is physically rendered and reported by the HMDQ tool, as this is a theoretical max. You may not get these numbers depending on your face shape, as this is what the headset is just telling applications to render, but if you have a good one, you should get somewhere around here. Not some bad values, and it meets Pimax's advertised claims of 116 horizontal FOV, which is always good to see given, historical precedent. If you're lacking performance and willing to sack FOV though, there is a narrow mode which culls a lot of the horizontal FOV. Moving on to normal mode with WIM FOV and my subjective results, which can sometimes measure slightly larger than the rendered. They also line up and are quite nice, given these are 1.3 inch panels. Horizontal and diagonal is good, bearing that in mind, and it's noticeably wider than what I get on something like the Quest 3. If I lay them out next to each other, especially on the diagonal axis, the difference feels incredibly pronounced. I have a very fortunate face shape for VR and tend to get the max or very close to it on every headset I've used, so you may not get these results yourself, but around mine are likely near ideal values. It's still certainly an above average FOV compared to most relevant headsets, but next to the truly wide things such as the 50 ppd module of the Super, I certainly feel the loss of vertical FOV myself, despite the horizontal not feeling as bad, honestly. Pimax did initially ship this with a 120 horizontal mode, by the way. Here are the render values, but it was not good. They said they'll eventually including it as a sort of a lab mode function, similar to the 50 ppd's wide FOV mode, but the 116 is the default. I still don't recommend the 120 for reasons I'll go into a bit later with the negatives of these optics. Since we talk performance, let's hit that because that's one thing which has really changed from the prototypes, as nothing good is ever free in life, especially field of view. This is the 100% resolution of the Super U OLED module, roughly 29.6 million pixels per eye. Now compare this to the prototypes and assumably the Dream Air, which is a more modest around 20.7 million. That's that's quite the jump. If you have a 5090, you can kind of just brute force that outside the super high things. I've had some videos covering even higher resolutions than this, but if you play something like, say, Flight Sims or a section of flat to VR mods, those are going to bring even this card to its knees. But if you're on something lesser, you're definitely going to have to dial the resolution or settings back a good bit. Fortunately, this headset downsamples incredibly well. You'll obviously see some image quality loss when you're going down well below 100%. But if you drop to, a bit more manageable 70, 80%-ish, especially if you combine it with Pimax's native sharpening solution to help clear up some of the fuzzies, the headset still looks great, and you are clearly benefiting from the physically very high-res panels. If you have to mostly run around there, though, I do not think you are wasting the headset, but if you have to start going way below that, I'd probably advise getting a GPU upgrade first. If you are desperate, the narrow FOV mode can get a decently lower render res target, but at that point, your field of view is going to be very tiny on what's still kind of a big headset. I would not get this if you're primarily going to be playing on that. I don't have anything besides a 5090 desktop and laptop to test on, so I can't speak too confidently on lower end stuff, but maybe I'll take a little more in-depth look at this on those parts if I do have the time. This is cutting edge VR tech though, so I don't think it's unreasonable to expect higher end parts are going to be required to drive it. For those of you who do play on high end games or lower end rigs, I did check out Pimax's smart smoothing, and it does sort of work, as you can see here. When I enable the setting to bring my FPS below 90, it does kick in. However, it takes a good couple seconds to do so. This also applies for when I go back to a situation when I can hit 90 FPS. So it is functional, but I wouldn't say it's ideal if you are wildly swinging between your frame rates all the time. In that case, you might be better served with the lock to half FPS option in their software and then just use smart smoothing. Visual quality wise though, I don't think I'm the best to judge it because I kind of hate anything that's not the literal industry best on motion smoothing, and even then 60 to 120 is kind of the minimum for me, not 45 to 90. And unfortunately, for those who like OpenXR, in a previous video I did comment that something seemed kind of off with respect to the frame pacing for Pimax's native runtime when you dip below your target refresh rate. At least it was fine when you were at locked FPS, and unfortunately that still seems like it is the case. I just really quickly threw these up from some brief testing in DCS, and anecdotally, when I had some dips testing quad views in Metro Awakening, it definitely felt off in a way that's a little hard to describe. If you can have that locked 90 or 72 refresh rate though, great time, no issues. All right, enough stalling. Let's get to the visuals because that's what you're here for. I'm gonna split the optics into two parts, positives first, then negatives. And let's start with the thing I think everyone wants to know, the glare. It's really good, actually. A lot better than the prototypes. Like so much better, I actually wonder if this is what people feel like when playing the lens lottery getting multiple replacements. I am somebody who hates glare, and even on the Quest 3, I find it kind of just alright. And even in my first impressions, I said this sometimes to pass the Quest 3, but still strongly disagreed with a number of people who said that glare is a total non-issue and solved problem. And I still don't agree with those people if they say that. But it is still incredibly well controlled. The most prominent place you're going to see these are the most high contrast scenes, of course, and like I said in my first impressions, it seems as if the glare is diffused across most of the lens, and if you look closely in places, yes, you can see the black levels do raise in some super high contrast areas with how it's impacted. Like when I was playing Outer Wilds and I'm looking into deep space, but then crane my neck toward the sun. However, Pimax has managed to further improve on it. As the last time I did some testing like this, I was able to immediately recognize the black levels were raised, whereas this time, yeah, I still did see it pretty quickly, but for a second or two, I actually wasn't too sure if it was still happening till I had the, oh, yep, there it is moment upon second glance. So that's really, really great. Now, I can't really illustrate how the effect is in a recording. When I tried making a mock-up, I could never get it quite right since it either didn't really show it at all or it made the raised blacks look worse than it actually was. So not perfect blacks when you do get bright elements, but it's still really great, and even if it does blunt the OLED somewhat, I haven't seen it feel completely wasted and pointless, which I sure did in places on the prototypes. However, this is not the only way glare manifests. It can sometimes seem to generally concentrate kind of towards the outer edges of the image. This can most obviously be seen when there are some brief but huge flashes of light, such as, say, the edge in VRChat. But it's still reasonably subdued, and perhaps it's a me thing, but I'm okay with not having perfection, as I believe comparing to the context of what's actually available on the market is important too, given every headset has compromises somewhere. This one included. We're going to get to that a little bit later. I'm also really not somebody who watches movies in VR. I just don't get it, but I got some people asking, so I tried to load up something in big screen in a dimmer environment with lots of flashes, because when I tried these on the prototype, it was genuinely so bad I could not fathom how anyone would have ever enjoyed this. But here, it was not too distracting. Present, but fairly minor. Still wouldn't personally watch movies though. And in some scenes with some really localized light, you might see a very faint double image or something like an equally faint circle in a small area. Again, all this stuff is things that if you look for it, you can and will definitely see it. I will fight anyone who says there is no glare on this headset, but I almost want to say it's just a minor issue that I don't think will bother you unless you really, really, really hate glare. And even then, I think it's livable at worst. Even the worst case scenarios are really not that bad. To briefly compare it to something like the QLED Super, as I know people are going to be interested in coming to this from that one, the Micro OLED is generally going to do better in contrast ratio and black levels. If we compare it to the highest local dimming setting on the QLED, which I don't personally recommend, it does feel similarly dark, and if you really squint, you may even see some elements that are blacker due to the slight diffusion of glare. But that tends to come with some not good at all blooming in high contrast scenes. If you go to the default halfway point on the slider, blooming can lessen a decent bit, and you do lose some contrast ratio though. At times, it can feel like there is a notable difference, whereas other times you think would do really bad and there'd be a giant difference, such as say the Outer Wilds No My VR mod menu with loads of differently colored stars and space. The QLED Super Micro-OLED can actually be pretty close, and there's not really super notable blooming to speak of. I mean, yeah, sure, it's not exactly as dark, but it doesn't feel that gigantic, honestly. Now, if we move on to the lowest level of local dimming, the black level difference becomes more obvious outside of some real worst cases scenarios for the Micro OLED, but the blooming is mostly fine outside worst cases for the QLED. So win some, lose some, I guess. But I've also heard some people with multiple units say the local dimming had some notable differences between them, so hell if I know if that's normal. Maybe I just got good units. It's all been reasonably nice on my 50 PPD, the 57, and the ultra-wide modules. Maybe that has to do with the Mira a bit, since it's related to the inconsistent brightness. Which, speaking of Mira, there is none on this thing if that's one of your most hated things in VR. This all said, I still stand by OLED being a bit overrated, and too much emphasis is put solely on one half of the dynamic range. Max brightness is a measure for a reason too, even if OLED does have some neat stuff to it. But now, my controversial takes aside, edge-to-edge clarity for sharpness is really stellar on this. Not quite up to the Quest 3, even given the larger FOV, but it's really close, and I can very comfortably read almost everything, even small details, through the majority of my vision. And this is really nice for something like reading my script here in VR, since I can sort of just put it anywhere. This is something that's not terribly affected by your IPD or the distance for your eyes. Further comparing it to the Quest 3, I think the darkening, the vignetting effect that you sometimes get at the edges of the lenses isn't really that bad here. Definitely better than Meta's headset. Another great job there, as I found that kind of a killer and also really highlighted the low stereo overlap on that. Persistence also seems all right now. It's better now that I have 90 hertz. It's still not great, but it's fine. But, concerning the orange color shift, this one's a bit complicated because it did get better, but that's not a free lunch either. It's mostly positive, that's why it's here. But there's also some problems with it. So, if we compare to the prototypes, Pimax has made quite a notable improvement on the color tinting when your eyes go away from the center of the screen. But it's still there. If you are playing with stuff that does not have very bright colors, such as, say, a dimmer environment like Metro Awakening, I want to say it's almost a non-issue. And even in some places which aren't super dark, it only feels deeply noticeable if you look way toward the edges. Yet it still does suck then and annoys me, but is way more livable than before. I also complained about issues with rapid head movements and being a gigantic issue due to the orange shift, and it is still there. I still can see it, but it is definitely a good improvement. Most of the time, at least. See, if you are playing where there is anything remotely close to white or gray, if you go slightly off-center at all, while it is extremely subtle, you will immediately notice that faint shift in colors. And once you see it, you will never be able to unsee it. At least I can't. Because upon a closer inspection in some other places, which I initially thought were gray after noticing this, I could not stop seeing the cursed color oh so subtly tainting my otherwise perfect vision. I do want to stress, it's better than before, and if you don't move your eyes around too much most of the time, it's minor but present. But it's like I opened Pandora's box for myself, since even if it can be somewhat ignored in some places, I just can't truly get it out of my mind unless the place is already heavily orange tinted, like Project Wingman, or it's dark, like Metro Awakening. It's so subtle. Part of me actually hates it because it's like this really faint, this isn't quite right feeling, and it's so good looking straight ahead. Like so. But then my eyes move a little to one way, and oh, there it is. I'm gonna sound crazy saying this, but I almost wish the middle had the same faint tint just for consistency, since I think it'd be easier to mentally filter out then. Almost! If you're listening, Pimax, please don't do this, because I'm certain this bothers me way more than most people, going by others I've talked to, including those that tried the Roadshow demos, which I hated the orange shift on. And I'm probably making it sound a little worse than it actually is right now, to be honest. This is gonna sound like damage control, and I can't set aside all my own preferences, but I am trying to be a little more objective as a reviewer and kind of step back. I think it is at a level that'll be fine for most people and tolerable, but I know there's going to be people out there like me who feel this way, so I gotta mention it. I have some unpopular opinions about pancakes and OLED, and I know it. But there is one extremely rare visual artifact that's come as a consequence to this improvement on the orange tinting. I have only seen this twice, maybe, outside the loading screens and the Steam VR Void, where it was the most visible. In fact, I can see it right now. During those environments, it's possible to kind of see a faint circle around your vision. The one place I saw it so badly, I bet even the blind could point it out, was again the Steam VR Void, where it sort of looked like something in this mock-up, as it does not show up in a recording when I try to get it. In actual gameplay, I think it's got a tendency more to appear in dark scenes, but again, I only saw it like twice, that being certain places in Metro Awakening and then a custom DCS night mission a friend made specifically because they wanted me to test glare. In both cases, it was way more subtle than the Steam VR Void, and I could even see somebody overlooking it in those situations, but if I tried to see it, I could. At least in what I've tried, I'd say it's a borderline not issue due to the rarity, but I can't test every game, so I don't know if it could become a problem, and that's why I mention it. If it's as rare as I think, though, I will take it any day of the week versus the pre-fix orange shift, because I literally never saw it. And I know it is because of trying to combat the color shift, because I got to try profiles with and without the fix, and the one without it definitely had worse orange shifting, but didn't have the circle. Also, the orange shift seems pretty sensitive to your IPD, but a little less so than before, and at least at my proper IPD of 68, seemed like everything was fine as it could be. You do really want to try and get your eyes as close to the lens as possible, however. And kind of just a very quick small note, there's a little bit of chromatic aberration on the edges, but it's very subdued versus the spheric lenses like on the other super modules. And now we get to the negatives of the optics, particularly the biggest thing, which is my main problem with the headset: distortions. I called this one in my first impressions. I said my biggest concern was distortions from pushing FOV even further, and it brings me no joy to say I was right. Looking straight ahead, during movement, you can kind of see some light distortions, which, if this was the only problem, I'd say it's okay, but it's not, because if you look to the far peripheral, there's some distortion similar to what I saw before, but worse. And if you look straight down, the distortions just, they really suck. And this is the problem because the vertical FOV is so small. It's not like the 50 ppd where yes, the vertical axis had some, but only at the absolute top with 20 degrees more FOV. On some elements, these are way less of an issue. Stuff like big geometry without a lot of fine little details, where there are times I can almost tune it out. But if it's a very menu navigation heavy game where you're frequently going to be looking at stuff with tiny little details such as text, I do not like it. It almost feels kind of disorienting when I very, very slowly move my eyes or my head and I could just see the image change right in front of me. Not like the usual motion sickness kind of way, more just like this feels really weird and wrong when I combine the distortion and the color shift. The interesting thing is when looking ahead, yes, there's standard distortions, but the peripheral and bottom ones, they don't really appear that much when I'm just looking dead on. I can actually enjoy the image in game reasonably nice, even if I have some gripes when I do that. It's kind of like the orange color shift in that regard, honestly. It's not as sensitive. I don't immediately see it when I look away from the center, but it's frustrating because I see how great this can be, and the majority of distortions aren't even there when looking straight on. Even when rapidly moving my head, they are quite minor. But it's just really not good when moving my eyes off center. The eye box on this headset just feels unreasonably small in a strange way, given that the sharpness and the way things feel in focus is really incredible, but a few other aspects of the picture just really struggle and hold it back. I know there are sure as hell gonna be people who disagree with me on this here, and maybe it's a face shape thing, or again, maybe it's a lens lottery, because boy, I've heard some stories from people getting RMAs, but my 50 ppd is just almost perfect geometrically outside those super far edges, and because those edges are much further out, at least personally, I find them more easily ignored, particularly since they're not too bad to begin with. As improved as the orange color shift is, when combined with the distortions, it kind of just isn't a headset I like to look around with my eyes very much, and so the incredible edge-to-edge sharpness feels a bit wasted. I think if it was just one or the other, it'd be kind of easier for me to live with it, but I feel really taken out of the experience when they're together. And I just really like having a headset where I can reliably move my eyes around for a decently consistent image and still be sharp in this day and age. I don't want to go back to that 2020 era mentality of you look around more with your head than you look around with your eyes. I actually went back to my QLED to do some testing after using this for a while and growing used to it, and Christ, that may be a bit the thing which hit me the most that I missed. It actually didn't bother me terribly at first, but like the more I use this, the more it hurts me and is becoming a deal breaker unless it's a slower game where I just won't move my head and eyes much. But a more active game where I'm just moving my eyes to focus on stuff like Legendary Tales and dueling, it's not fine. It's really distracting. This is honestly the one area that I think the prototypes were just better in these final optics. Those had some slight distortions, yes, but they were better. And if the orange color shifting and glare could be improved as much on those as it was on these, I don't know, man. Despite the smaller FOV, I might prefer those if you made me pick between these two at gunpoint. I do not prefer those without the glare and color shift fixes, though. These are better overall. And nothing I did fixed the issues for me. Not adjusting my IPD, trying to move the HMD around my head, not even taking the damn gasket off and shoving it on my face. Not that it got me much closer, before anyone suggests that. It was kinda just always there. And on the 120 horizontal FOV profile Pimax gave me to test initially with this issue was worse. Noticeably worse. I could see the distortions around the general image even when looking straight ahead, which just was really not good. As impressive as it is to get larger FOV out of these tiny little panels, I think Pimax is kinda just pushing it a bit past the breaking point. Okay. After all that negativity, let's talk the other side of the visuals and something a little more positive. The screens, since it also helps me timestamp and structure this video into a little more smaller chunks than one giant thing. So these are micro OLED panels with some impressive specs, namely the quicker pixel response time versus LCD, that's a given with OLED, which just generally translates to a smoother visual experience. The people who say things like 72 and 90 Hz on OLED feel like 90 and 120 on LCD in VR, I don't agree with you. I think this is an exaggeration. However, the general principle of it feeling smoother is true. And as somebody who does like my smooth motion from high FPS, I own a 240 Hz monitor. While it's not 120 Hz, 90 Hz on the micro OLED does feel really nice to have, and that smoothness was one of the things I missed on my QLED Super versus the original Crystal. And this can do 90 Hz in native res without any upscaling needed, like the Dream Air SE or the Big Screen Beyond models need. Now, brightness-wise, though, yeah, it's a huge step down from the 50 ppd. I redid my measurements with my Lux meter across the board after getting to know the thing a little more and how to best utilize it, which resulted in some higher measurements everywhere. So here's a side-by-side using the max setting of the meter, and yeah, I think the numbers do speak for themselves here. I did also use the peak function, which records even quicker intervals, less than 100 microseconds. I believe that is more accurate, as both didn't see much of a jump, but I know less here, so I'm just going to present the numbers for people to make their own opinion. Again, note these are lux, not nits. And yes, things like the per pixel control of OLED can help do the contrast and in dim environments, but it doesn't change objective brightness. Highlights even in dark environments like some burning barrels in Saints and Sinners, I just think they feel more impressive on the QLED. But on the other hand, the micro OLED does do dimmer areas of that same environment better, especially those that don't have some singular super bright element, and it's quite impressive there. So once again, I think it's kind of a preference thing somewhat. Now, comparing this to the Quest 3, I'm not 100% sure, as unlike the Super, there was actually a huge difference in the peak versus max measurement that I couldn't replicate on my other headsets. Going by max, the micro OLED actually measured brighter. If I used peak, the Quest 3 turned out brighter. There was a little variance in the numbers, but not that much, so I don't know. Neither feel particularly bright, but compared to most headsets nowadays, they're just fine. And given the micro OLED is around Quest 3 brightness, give or take a bit, while maintaining decent persistence, that's pretty good, given what I hear about some other stuff like the big screen Beyond 2. This panel does also have the capacity to render in 10-bit color depth, but that doesn't really appear to matter here because pretty much all of VR is stuck at 8-bit color depth, since that was a standard for ages. Unless the app specifically calls for 10-bit color, then you're not going to benefit 8 versus 10-bit. Compositors like Steam VR do support 10-bit depth. I don't know if Pimax's does, as I asked, but I couldn't get an answer, but that's meaningless when the game doesn't render it. I did also try and play around with some injectors to force it, like say Special K, but while it affected the desktop screens, no changes were ever reflected inside the actual headset. So as of now, the 10-bit depth, it doesn't really mean much. Maybe there's like some modded VR stuff that may potentially use it, but I don't have every game to test with that. But even that aside, the colors on this are still really great and better than anything else I've used. I don't think they're too oversaturated, and most stuff looks pretty good in it. Though I still don't think it's that much of a change from the high-end QLED as well, if you're expecting to be blown away while already on it. Sharpness-wise, as default 100% resolutions, this is an amazingly clean image and is a slight but noticeable step up from the 50 ppd. I think it helps that the image is just clean in a way that the QLED module can't really match in some scenes, due to the lack of Mura. Despite what I said about brightness, I could see some potentially preferring this because the worst case scenarios for the QLED also tend to be the brightest ones, hilariously enough. So if Mura really bothers you, then you'll really like this a lot because there's pretty much none to speak of. That sharpness is also the very specific reason I am using it for these in front of the camera segments, despite all my other complaints, as it makes reading text easier, and I don't really care about my immersion or field of view while doing desktop work or reading a script. Legibility is all that matters. Let's go back to something a little more positive and can also be quick. The comfort. So this headset is noticeably lighter than the QLED modules, but here's the weight versus the 50 ppd. I don't have the best scale, so give or take a little, but you sure do feel this when it comes to longer extended sessions in game. If you're running mainly stock, I do think the difference is a lot more pronounced with the weight distribution. But if you're a complete madman like myself, running 6 different comfort mods, including 3 top straps, the difference is not as standout, but you will notice it, and during sessions which you go for a couple hours, the lack of weight does add up. And there's also less inertia when you swing your head like this during rapid movements. That can matter for active play. It may not be something incredibly tiny like the Megane X or the coming Dream Air, but I like the hard strap since it helps with a snug and stable fit for your headset. Plus it's just easier to fit stuff like the DMAS headphones on with the weight distribution. Now for seated cockpit games, given the less intensive nature of those, it might not be noticed unless you are a true marathon gamer, but still just an overall subtle improvement even in those, and there's less need to adjust your headset. Though I do think there's some potential room for concerns on comfort if you have a huge nose and very small IPD, like below 65 or so. Because when I was desperately trying to fix the distortions, I tried even really small IPD, but 64 and below just they felt kind of unusable since the lenses would put my nose in too much of a vice grip. I previously tested down to 66 and it was fine, so I didn't initially comment about this. Audio-wise, this is the exact same as every other Super module. But if you haven't seen those videos, here's the microphone on the Crystal Super. I am running this at 40 volume in Windows because I peaked the hell out of it at max. It's definitely not a great microphone, and compared to some other headsets in this price class, you can definitely tell some corners were cut here. It's fine and will be serviceable in normal multiplayer stuff. Now, back to the good audio, let's talk about speakers. Speaker-wise, well, there's two things here concerning the default S-Mass the headset ships with. They're fine at best. Not great, not the worst, but you might be underwhelmed. I still do find it nice there's at least present audio solution compared to the very high-end options increasingly ditching at stock. Things like the Big Screen Beyond and Megane X are very much bring your own audio. The former does have a strap they sell, yes, but you don't get audio to begin with. At least having audio here just helps the out-of-the-box experience feel more complete, even if it is still lacking in some spots. I do personally agree with cutting some corners on audio stock, since it's much easier to upgrade your audio than it is the screen and visuals. Pimax does even offer their own DMAS audio, which, again, I have right now, which is really damn good in some top-level VR audio. It's a viable upgrade, so yes, that's extra money, but if you want high-level VR audio, this will definitely get to you. And it's not going to be as finicky as using your own pair of headphones, which I really hate doing. All right, so that said, now let's get to a quick update on the tracking and the software. This is still the same as the other Super modules, which I have covered in depth before, so I'm gonna keep some stuff a little brief because there have been some notable changes to just touch on. Firstly, software-wise, I like it. But you will definitely get the most out of it as an enthusiast. There are a lot of options in here, which, if you don't know what they do, you probably should just leave untouched. Pimax is having a big 2.0 update, which I was able to use an early version of, that has a lot more tooltips and explanations, which, personally, I do think make it a lot more intuitive. I haven't really been able to test a more final version of it, and what I got didn't work with the micro OLED at the time, so I'll just save that for a more in-depth review someday. But there's a lot of cool options in the software. A big one is the ability to use foveated rendering of two types, the first being central priority rendering, which can be injected into a good bit of open VR games to boost performance from a light to moderate degree. Then there's the other one, quad views, which leads to some incredible performance gains of upwards of double performance. To use this with their native software, though, you do have to use Pimax's OpenXR runtime, and it only works with a handful of games. But then there's you can use things like sharpening to increase image quality, especially useful when you are lowering the resolution slightly, and the per-eye software IPD offsets and color adjustments. Pimax's software really does just keep improving, and I know some people have had some serious issues with it, but I don't know. It's kind of just worked for me across multiple systems and headsets. Some of the stuff you can do on other headsets, like modding and sharpening and the lesser form of foveated rendering, works in a number of games. But having it natively built into the software stack is awesome and helps with compatibility, since those features can be used in some games which don't support modding. Though this all said, how important these features are to you is going to depend on what you play, of course. If Pimax is your first headset, though, I'd still be cautious or talk to a friend with experience to help you with it a bit. And also software related, so it goes here, but I know a lot of people were quite interested in the optical stack for stuff like social VR, and if software such as Broken Eye would work to get advanced eye tracking parameters. And unfortunately, it does not. It does not work. You cannot use Broken Eye with this, as there have been some notable changes to how Tobii handles things. You are stuck with the basic Tobii parameters and OSC transmission Pimax has, and things don't sound optimistic for making it work either. I've been going back and forth with some people trying to get something working, trying to learn more about this, but it sounds like it'd be a ton of work to do, and there's not really much optimism about it. If this is of significant value to you and part of your purchasing decision, then just don't buy it yet. That could change one day, but you really should wait till it does rather than buy now and pray, because it could just as easily never change. Okay, so moving on to the tracking with these little fun things, the SLAM controllers. This one is a little difficult for me because Pimax's tracking is done on the CPU rather than an onboard SoC like what the Quest line uses. Because of this, that means you could be in for you're in for a bad time if you have a lower end CPU. But my rigs, they have a 9950X3D and Core Ultra 275HX in my laptop. These are top-end CPUs relative to the form factor they're in. Even if I disable the second CCD of the Ryzen chip, it's a good CPU. So I've not really had too much in the way of tracking issues. For the most part, that is. At least on the controllers. They deal with one-handed and quick motions quite well, and no significant problems there, I find. Concerning occlusion, though, like aiming down the sights, you do get some jitter there, but it's been further refined and improved with recent updates. I'd say it's decently fine there now, actually, if still gonna make you miss some shots sometimes. A while back, while doing some testing on my laptop, and I can't show this in recording, so you just kind of have to trust me on this, there were some problems with the head tracking where it's like the headset would lose track of its position and everything would wobble like it were unstable. But that's not an issue on the latest clients, which is nice. Even then, though, I was still able to fix it with Process Lasso by pinning Pimax to the E cores and the game to the P cores. And while I do think most people considering this are going to have a strong CPU, if you've got something that's kind of mid to low end, like say something pre-Zen 4 or 12th gen Intel, unless that chip was the top end at the time and you're willing to Process Lasso some dedicated cores to Pimax's processes, you might be in for a bad time with the SLAM tracking this comes with. And even then, in real CPU-intensive games, you might have a rough time unless it's at least upper, mid-end, and modern. I have heard a few reports that with the latest update, at the time of this writing that is, that's improved the tracking for some people who are complaining about it quite a lot. This one is harder for testing me though, because at least on higher-end systems, again, it's pretty great. I rarely do feel limited by the tracking, and it works out pretty fine for almost everything I do. Even shooters, with one notable exception. The play space memory for this headset and its ability to remember the floor height between even just taking it off, it is still complete and total garbage. If you use this for standing play, every time you boot up this headset, or just even take it off, you're probably gonna have to do a little ritual of using the built-in quick room setup, which thankfully does only take like 5 seconds, of saying your floor height with a trigger press and then confirming. This can be done without killing Steam VR if you use it, which is awesome. It is nice to have a first-party workaround that's quick and easy, even if I'd obviously be better for the play space to just track it properly, but I think this is kind of just something you gotta live with. If you don't like the SLAM tracking or you're very in love with your lighthouses, there is a lighthouse faceplate coming at some point. Hopefully soon that you can use. Alrighty then, let's summarize. This headset, it does have some good points to it that I think will be appealing to people who are OLED or deaf. The glare is present, but it's largely quite minimal, and close to a minor issue, I'd say. You can sometimes spot black levels being a bit raised or appearing at the edges of your vision, but generally it's subtle and one can definitely appreciate higher contrast scenes with it. The sharpness of this is something just real incredible, and paired with excellent colors, it makes for a completely fantastic image in the middle when looking straight on. We're at desktop levels of sharpness. Not quite 4K, but we're getting impressively close to it. This is also paired with deceptively good comfort despite the size. And the FOV is excellent for micro OLED, given where most of the industry is sitting on that. Even the brightness is good for pancake lens headsets, which lose a lot of light from their optics. I mean, yes, compared to actually bright stuff like the QLED Super, it falls very short there, but versus the average headset, it's fine, and I think most will be okay with it. In some ways, I do think the lenses can match or even exceed the Quest 3, namely glare and dark vignetting, at least when the headset's perfectly dialed in. There's still nothing which quite matches the Quest 3 being nearly immune to the wrong IPD setting. But in other ways, the lenses have problems, and despite the praise I just gave, at the end of the day, personally, I just don't like this. Because the flaws or compromises it has are ones I'm not really willing to make. And surprisingly, the deal breakers are not the ones I expected it to be for me. When your eyes go anywhere off center, problems arise fast, and it's kind of death by 1,000 cuts. There's the color shift that'll depend somewhat on the environment you're in, granted. In darker areas, it's almost a non-issue. Even in some lighter areas, it can be reasonably subtle if you're not looking at the absolute furthest edges, but it is just enough that once you notice it's there, it's really hard to not see it. Maybe it's because I do a lot of video editing and it constantly jumps at me every single time I move my eyes in those environments, so I'm kind of looking at colors a lot. But this is further compounded by the slight distortions present, as together, it really just makes the virtual environment feel off to me anytime my eyes go outside the center in anything but dimmer environments. And in those environments, though, credit where credit is due, the headset can look really nice, but I am still bothered by the distortions a bit. And again, being fair though, I do think these are going to bother me way more than most people, because I directly asked Pimax if there are any of the other reviewers that complained about it as much as I did. And the answer was, to quote word for word, some distortions mentioned, but not like you. So, make of that what you will. If you're somebody who's not bothered by those or can just tune them out better for whatever reason, I'm happy for you. But this module it just generally isn't for me. I still prefer my 50 ppd Super. I still prefer spheric lenses to pancake lenses. And I fully admit, that's probably going to be an unpopular opinion. But the warping, it just kind of kills it for me, especially with the color shift. I actually like this headset a decent bit initially, but the more I use it, the more environments I test, I just start getting bothered by the problems more and more, and my opinion begins souring, especially after going back to my QLED Super. And this all it kind of puts me in an awkward spot, as normally I'd say what kind of people this would be for, even if it's not for me, but because I'm really against the grain here, not being big on pancake lenses or micro OLED, given the current limitations of the technology, and my issues are problems most people don't seem to have with them. It's a little hard, because not thinking those are the best thing ever kind of makes me feel like this. But again, I guess I'll try and set aside some of my own personal opinions and maybe try to be a little more objective as a reviewer. If you're somebody who's mostly fine with just moving their head and not their eyes, I think one can have a much better time with this, as I can't really emphasize enough, the thing looks great when looking ahead. And it's nowhere near as bad as the 57 ppd was with the artifacts outside the center, which is why I am softer here, because you can at least look around a little. Things actually look sharp when you're outside the middle. If you play primarily in largely dimmer and darker environments where things like the color shifting, it's not going to hit as badly, then you might get more out of this than me. Because how well the glare is controlled, it's great, and it does help the OLED shine, when pancake lens glare can also sometimes really blunt that. Yes, the glare still does do that sometimes, and it gets a little annoying, but overall it's pretty good. And I use things like the Apple Vision Pro. I hated the glare on that. So if you are somebody kind of like that, or you can't stand Mira and want wider FOV micro OLED, it's your choice of money to spend at the end of the day. I'll have an affiliate link down below with a small discount code. Just make sure you're informed no matter what you do. I really like to encourage going to check out some more opinions on this than just making me the only person you listen to, because VR is very individualized and everyone has different priorities. You may be willing to make entirely different compromises than me, or you're bothered by different things. And Pimax does have a 14-day return period if you want to try it. I will say, if you are primarily going to use the micro OLED on the Super, unless the FOV is your big draw, I might just wait and see what comes with the Dream Air instead, since it's going to be using the same panels and a similar optical stack. If you already own a Super though, it's like almost $1,000 cheaper before taxes, so that's quite meaningful. And we don't know when the hell that's going to be coming out. But at the risk of using this as ammo to dismiss my complaints, even though I don't think this is the case, if you are interested in this, maybe keep an eye on people's impressions of the lenses. There's not a big enough sample size to determine if there will be a lens lottery here or not. There was one with the spheric lens crystal headsets, and something like the Big Screen Beyond 2 has a pretty horrid variance in QC with all the impressions I've seen. This could or could not be the case here, where we end up having to play the lottery. We just kind of need some more user impressions to determine that. But anyway, there is the video. What, expecting a rant about Pimax's company policies again? No, not this time. Aside from being really late on dates, which unfortunately that's kind of a given, and a bit of a problem in the small to mid-level VR space in general, it's not just them, I think Pimax has mostly delivered on what they claimed, which I do love to see. Field of view hits the advertised 116, and Pimax hasn't had any recent major controversies, at least about this. I've talked about some other ones in other videos. I'm gonna instead be saving that energy for the ultra-wide review rant, because I got some stuff to say there. Believe me. If you made it to the end though, thank you for watching. Let me know what you thought in the comments. Are you ready to hang me for my take on pancake lenses and micro OLED? Do you agree with me? Whatever you do, consider subscribing to see what I do next, but if not, maybe I'll see you again in the recommended sometime. Later.